All right. Hi, how is everybody? I don't know how many people are on right now, but nonetheless, here we are with episode number 53 of the Trauma Informed Educators Network podcast, which is hashtag TIN Network Cast on most social media platforms. And I am so excited to have today's guest. She is bringing a wealth of experience, a wealth of knowledge, some amazing written work, and even more great life and professional experiences. So Karen, how are you? Welcome to the podcast. I cannot wait for the listeners to hear about you, your work, and the knowledge you share. So, first of all, how are you? And welcome. And tell us the Karen story.
All right. Well, first of all, hello. Nice to be with you. I'm delighted to share with both you and your audience the work that I do in trauma for students and nonprofit organizations. So, as to my story, and I think it's really important, by the way, to self-situate so that people have a sense of who I am and where I come from, because it's really easy to make assumptions about people based on the color of their skin or how they appear. So I grew up in a household where I did not grow up speaking English. I speak 3 languages, of which English is but one. I grew up in a household that from the outside would have looked very successful and wonderful, but on the inside was filled with lots of dysfunction and abuse. And so I tell people very openly, both in my writing and speaking, that I have an ACE score, an adverse childhood experience score of a 7. And I say that because it's important to understand that the work I do is informed by theory, it's informed by practice, but it's also informed by life experience. So I was a college president. I also was a senior policy advisor for the US Department of Educator during the Obama administration. And perhaps the greatest insight I had from that, in addition to doing lots of graduate school teaching, is that if you want to make a difference in the world of education, you have to back up the educational train. I mean, you have to back it way up. You have to back it up at least as far as pre-K and perhaps even further to pregnancy and thinking about child development. And so, as important as the work was that I did at the policy level and at the collegiate level and graduate school level, most of my time now is spent thinking about how to help students succeed, particularly students who've experienced trauma, and how trauma impacts not only their learning, but their psychosocial development. And sadly, in today's world, the number of children and families who've experienced trauma from the pandemic, but from lots of other sources, is abundant. And so the work is not only needed, but for me, it holds the hope for the future. And I want to make sure that the next generation is in good hands. So that's who I am, and that's what I do.
Well, and thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you for your vulnerability. I do appreciate that. And I know that sharing those things, it takes vulnerability. And I appreciate that you're willing to step in that space and say, this is my experience, this is my life, and this is what pushes the work. Because we're all passionate for a variety of reasons. And many of us have had those experiences, which connects to life experience, right? And you talk about that, the impacts of all of these pieces. And I think now that as an elementary school principal, we are back in school. Mostly, I think most of the country, if not all, are back in person. What do you think is happening right now? And do you think that schools anticipated what this return was going to be like? And what are you hearing and seeing and writing about and your experiences? Were we ready? Were people ready?
So, a really important question with multiple subparts, by the way. So, I think we thought that the start of this academic year would be better than last year. I think we thought and I work with a number of school districts and a number of school counselors across the globe. I think we thought that the return from online or hybrid learning to in-person learning would be joyful for students and educators alike. Sadly, I think we underestimated the impact of the last 18 months, which includes the impact of social distancing, includes the impact of family dysfunction, includes the impact of the lack of touch, includes the impact of a lack of engagement with peers. In a world that we thought would be more certain than it is, and in the absence of all of those things, what educators are seeing is lots of students who are struggling and lots of issues in classroom management, including from teachers who have been historically amazing classroom managers. And the hardest part for me is that teachers, educators, are struggling so hard to help their students, and yet they're getting pressure from the administration. No offense, I know you're an administrator, as was I, but they're getting pressure from the administrator to focus on content and to help kids catch up and to make sure all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed that the state requires. But the truth of the matter is, our kids need to focus on psychosocial development. That's what they really lost. And what I say to people is behavior is the language of trauma. And so when we see kids acting out, we should sit up and take notice and figure out what to do.
So why do you think classroom management has got so much more challenging? And why do you think that teachers who have historically been so successful now find them in a space of going, oh my goodness, what do I do?
Well, that's not an easy question either. Your questions are really good ones. So I think part of the problem is that students are coming in experiencing and exhibiting trauma symptomology. And among the types of symptomology they're showing is dysregulation. Now, dysregulation differs depending on your age, but it's everything from yelling to not sitting up and paying attention to throwing things around the room to fighting with other kids to not concentrating, to throwing chairs, to not getting in line, to not doing assignments. Dysregulation takes many forms depending on your age and stage. So kids who were aware of the kind of structure and stability and safety that schools provided lost that for 18 months, and many of them probably lived in a world that didn't have sufficient structure and stability and safety and someone to take care of them and personalization. And if there's a silver lining to this, it is to indicate how immensely important schools are and the role that they can play in children's lives. If anything, this tells me that schools are more than just places for content distribution. They're places that allow kids to stabilize. They're places that allow kids to grow emotionally and socially. They're places that give kids safety, including food and an absence of violence and other kinds of abuse or trauma. And so I think what teachers are seeing is the impact of 18 months out of school, and they're seeing what I would call trauma symptomology in the students that are there. And I'd add that unfortunately, many teachers are not trauma trained, so they don't have the toolbox of skills that would help them re-regulate a dysregulated classroom. And so their response is often one that actually makes it worse, not better. Although they're trying really hard and they're exhausted and they're doing their best, the challenges they're facing are new for them and they're struggling.
And I agree. And here's what I have seen in my experience as well. We're in a dysregulation cycle. Kids are dysregulated, adults become dysregulated, kids become dysregulated, adults, or adults are dysregulated, kids become dysregulated. It has become a cycle where there's this constant cycle of dysregulation on every aspect, right? On every aspect, on the adults, on the kids, on the administrators. I found myself having to push my pause button. The strategy I use the most: just stop, pause, check yourself, know what I'm feeling right now, know why, or try to anticipate why I'm feeling it, get myself back to regulated by using the power of breath. I've been doing that more this year than I ever have, right? Because I know I impact the culture of the school, the teachers I interact with, the kids I interact with. I think right now so many schools are in a culture of dysregulation because of all of those things you said. And I think the power of something that we have to get into is, how do we stop that cycle of dysregulation from adult to kid, from kid to adult? What is the secret sauce? Because right now, I think from what I hear and all the educators I get to speak to and chat with and interact with, is I'm hearing this. I'm so overwhelmed. When we take that into classrooms, we literally and emotionally take that into classrooms. This whole idea of leave it at the door is nonsense. It's not possible. That's not how we're wired as human beings. So what are some ideas? Because I'm trying to think of some of myself in the midst of this right now.
All right. So I have lots of ideas, but let me start with this observation. Trauma is like an invisible backpack, and we carry it with us. And often others don't see it, and it can grow over time when trauma gets re-triggered. And students are not the only ones carrying trauma backpacks. Adults carry them too. So I would tell you that the architecture for thinking about this is to be able to name what's happening to yourself or to your students, to then work on strategies to ameliorate it, and then to frame it, as in create a structure in which to function, and a frame, as in a frame of a picture, in which to recognize the importance of identifying trauma and its symptomology. So for me, it starts by acknowledging what's going on. And then you can start to ameliorate it. If you don't acknowledge it and think it's attention deficit disorder, or you think it's some other bad kid acting out, you'll never get far enough down the road to be able to deal with it. So what I tell teachers to do, if I'm just truncating large training, I tell them to remember the 4 C's, as in the letter C. Stay calm. Role modeling calm is probably amongst the hardest but most significant thing that educators can do, because students get their cues from the adults in the room. And if the adult gets agitated and upset, then that redounds back to the students. So calm. Mm-hmm. Role model calm. The second is, now is a time for what I would call caring and compassion. It is not the time for punishment and discipline, in part because we punish and discipline when kids intend to do something bad. So if you're doing something bad and it isn't by intention, but it's a symptom of trauma, then all the punishment in the world isn't going to rectify the situation. So caring and compassion and understanding what's going on is the second C. Start, for example, asking good questions. If you ask kids, even really young kids, they will tell you what's going on if you ask in the right way. Don't assume, ask. So you seem to be angry. Share with me what's bothering you. That's a way better strategy than, oh my God, what are you doing? Or what's wrong with you? You're acting awful. That is not helpful. What's helpful is to say, so surely something's bothering you. Talk to me about what's troubling you, and maybe I can help you. All right. So the third is communication. The third C. So one of the things that trauma does is it truncates communication and connection. It literally does it in the brain. And what I say to people is you've got to communicate more with all the constituencies within a school. You have to communicate better with your students and in a really personal way. Use their names, send them texts, send them emails, stay in touch with them. Administrators need to be in communication regularly and consistently with the teachers. And everybody has to be communicating with the parents and guardians and the larger community. So communication has to be at a premium, and it has to be open, it has to be honest, it has to be transparent, and it has to be regularized. So an email every pop chance that one thinks of it isn't it. You need an email every day or every Wednesday, or celebrating every kid's birthday by sending them an e-card. Okay. And the last C, so we've got calm, caring, communicating, and the last is connecting. So kids need authentic connections with adults who genuinely care about them. And you can establish connections in a myriad of ways. Conversations is one of them. Expressions and outreach is another. Facial expressions, even in the presence of masks, speak. So does tone. But connecting with a student, engaging with them, helping them to understand that trauma cuts off connection. And I often tell people, if you want an easy way to start to do this, give every kid a box of paper clips. Then they start by connecting the paper clips. They're doing the physical act of connecting. And then let them make a string of paper clips. And then let them connect those paper clips with the paper clips chains of the students next to them, and then the ones next to them. And then you can have a paperclip chain around the entire room, connecting everyone together. So connection can happen through the start of physical connection, even in a world of social distancing and masks. And then it leads to internal communication and connection. So it's very interesting. The literature is really clear on this. There are adverse childhood experiences, but there are also positive childhood experiences. There are positive adult experiences too. But for me, the most significant positive childhood experience is a child having 2 or more caring adults who genuinely believe in their capacity to succeed. And who are those people? Well, that's all of you educators, social workers, psychologists. You're those people that can help kids get over their trauma, have a positive childhood experience, and grow psychosocially.
And I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that those 4 C's are imperative. And to be honest, are almost required for building those compassionate, connected schools. And I think I go back to one of our previous guests, actually he's been on here twice, Dr. Bruce Perry, and his regulate, relate, reason process. When I learned those 3 simple processes of I have to first regulate by relating and then get to the reasoning part when I'm working with a student that's dysregulated. Game changer for me, right? So much game, just knowing those 3 things. And I walk myself through those even in the moments. And then when you talk about connection, I think that is the key. And I think authentic connection, affirmations are imperative. Simply noticing kids. Because I think when you began, we talked about the characteristics of a dysregulated child. But I think some of them that are commonly missed are the perfectionist or the class clown, or these pieces where I need to be noticed as a class clown. People think that that's just a behavior that wants attention. But to be honest, for me, I needed to be noticed, right?
Well, let me put it to you this way.
Yeah.
Attention seeking
It's connection
is
seeking.
actually connection seeking.
Absolutely.
Behavior is the language of trauma.
Mm-hmm.
So when you see behavior, it should be like a tip-off that something is going on to which one should be paying lots and lots of attention. And I think if you reflect on what I'm going to show you now, it may be one of those tools that helps people. So trauma has acute symptomology, and then it has deferred symptomology. So I want to talk about acute symptomology. So I'm going to just roll up my sleeve so you can see how this goes. So if you hold your arm up like this, okay, do it with me.
And for those listening on the podcast, we're just putting our hand up in the air.
Okay, so your thumb is your limbic system. So tuck your thumb in and then put your fingers around your thumb. So in a fully functioning brain, our limbic system is operating, our feeling system, and then our cognition is operating. That's the top part. Now, sometimes feelings hijack cognition. That's true. And there's a cognitive triangle known as behavior on the one side and thoughts on the other and feelings on another. But if everything's going all right, the limbic system is in order and cognition is there. This part here at your wrist is the primitive brain. Some people call it the reptilian brain. Other people call it the brain stem. Whatever you call it, it's what gets triggered when there's acute trauma symptomology. It houses your autonomic nervous system. So here's what happens to kids who have acute trauma. Their brain literally flips out. And when a kid says, I'm flipped out, they really are flipped out. And this is a language that you can share with them, and they can say to you, I'm flipped out. And our job is to then get the limbic system back and the cognition back so that you can then begin learning. Because if you're flipped out, you can be the best reading teacher in America or the globe, and the kid isn't going to learn. And by the way, it's akin to saying that a kid who comes to school hungry can have the best reading teacher in the globe and can't read because they're hungry. So if your brain is flipped out, our job is to help it so that the limbic system and cognition goes back into place and the autonomic nervous system is quieted so that then learning can begin. And we make a really bad assumption that when children appear in school, that's synonymous with their being ready, willing, and able to learn. Presence is not the same as ready, willing, and able to learn. And so for me, one of the critical features is to alert teachers to the fact that what kids are doing when they're acting out or dysregulated or overregulated or isolating are all things stemming from trauma and its symptomology. And so one of the critical features here is not to punish the child, to discipline the child. It's to help them re-regulate. And my view is that you help with re-regulation if you do what's called processing in place. Rather than sending a kid out where they're already struggling with connection. So now you're going to disconnect them and send them, no offense to the principal, but send them to the principal. I think it's way better for the principal to come in, or the social worker to come in, or the therapist to come in, or the school counselor to come in and process in place, not only for the kid who's struggling, but all the other kids realize, oh, wait, I'm not going to get sent away. I'm going to get helped. And that message is hugely important.
And I think you're spot on. And I'm going to be honest and tell you, when you come to connection, I think one of the things is personalization and looking at kids individually. Because I'm going to be honest, Karen, there's kids that if I come in the classroom, it spins them even more out of control. There's kids, if I come to the classroom, it helps them calm, right? And I think sometimes we just have to get those individual nuances of kids, because there are some connected truths that align through this work for sure. But I think the one thing that we have to be cognizant of is we have to look at kids as individuals, because every kid, I know there's kids, if I simply walk into the room, and it's not because I have a bad relationship, it's because they may have had a bad experience just for me being a principal. I will tell you, I don't send kids home. I co-regulate. I've even been accused of rewarding kids for coming to the principal's office. No, it's called co-regulation. I actually am getting them calm. I have all kinds of games that help with them to dysregulate through all kinds of processing information. But I think you are so spot on. You articulated that so well with the Siegel brain model. And I think we have to get this to every educator. I spoke at the Tennessee Principal Association 2 weeks ago to principals from across the state. And I simply asked them one question. How many of you ever heard of ACEs? Do you know how many people raised their hand? About 30% of the room. The basic understanding of trauma has not been completely incorporated into education.
And I worry, by the way, that ACEs then become the knowledge, and ACEs are only a part.
Yeah, I think that's the conduit, though. Do you agree? Most people are coming through this work through understanding adverse childhood experiences. We know it was Kaiser Permanente and CDC, health outcomes had nothing to do with education, but that's the avenue many people are coming through who haven't understood the work as deeply as you have me.
So one of the interesting things for me is, why is it that education about trauma and trauma amelioration is not part of the education that we provide to our educators when they're getting their degrees? I mean, is there some reason that we don't generally offer courses in trauma in at least American schools of education? And if it's there, it's like a tweensy segment of, some other course on understanding child psychology or something. But we would do way, way better. And I'm not, by the way, suggesting that educators are therapists or educators are social workers.
Don't have to be.
Or educators are any other kind of licensed professional other than what they are.
Fact.
But there are trauma tools that they can use.
Absolutely.
And trauma-informed pedagogy that will help all children. Now, here's an interesting observation I often get that is related to your comment about you're helping kids in your office. So people read what I write and listen to what I say, and there is a subgroup of people who say, but you're coddling. You're not developing responsibility. You're allowing bad behavior to continue. You're not letting people pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Okay. And if I've heard it once, I've heard it 1,000.
A million times, Karen, me too.
And what I say to people is, If we can help kids succeed, does it matter how we do it? I mean, really, at the
I
end of
agree.
the day,
Yeah.
does it matter if some kids need more help and different strategies, as long as at the end of the day, they find a pathway towards success? And if it takes initially extra reinforcement, extra help, that's fine. And by the way, I absolutely believe in responsibility,
Mm-hmm.
individual responsibility, but
Mm-hmm.
I also believe in understanding kids
Mm-hmm.
and understanding where they come from.
Absolutely.
Just because you help them doesn't mean you abdicate their sense of autonomy and responsibility. So it's distressing to me that we're fighting on many fronts to help people realize, both within and outside of schools, that we desperately need to help our children succeed, because in addition to their own success, there's the risk of the epigenetic transmission of trauma, which means it moves intergenerationally and across generations, not culturally, but through your RNA. I mean, it literally transmits over time. Don't we all, the adults amongst us, want to make sure the next generation is in good hands?
Mm-hmm.
And if that's true, let's do what we can to make that happen.
So early on, you said, why aren't we doing these things? That's because we're fighting against literally centuries of archaic thinking and processing. That's why. Because we're actually trying to shift a paradigm. Our whole basis of our education system is built on the behaviorist idea. That is how it's built. And on secondly, we also are having built on an education that historically wasn't designed for everyone. It simply wasn't designed for kids who struggle. It wasn't designed for minority kids or kids with disabilities. By design, that's how our education system has been set up. So we're not only shifting these paradigms of the neuroscience and understanding the impact of trauma, but we're also trying to shift this equity lens of we have to see things in a different way. And I think that's why we're not having these. I will tell you, I'm very proud of a lot of universities here in my own city of Nashville, Tennessee. That includes Vanderbilt University, Belmont University, Trevecca University. All kinds of universities are actually now having courses around this work. I'm also proud to say we are a teaching school. Matter of fact, next semester we have 11 student teachers coming through our school. And we do that because we're trying to do our part of building the capacity of educators to not only understand, right, the impacts of trauma, but building their skills, because this is a skill building process. You have to build skill in this work.
But I think you may be the exception. I actually
It's
don't
true.
think, while there certainly are trauma responsive and trauma sensitive schools across our nation and
Right.
across the globe, it's not exactly like this is caught on like wildfire
Not
and
at all.
everybody is like on board and on task
Not at
and
all.
gets it.
I
Um,
agree.
and I agree with you about our educational system originally being designed for the elite, and a recognition that now access to education and educational equality is an opportunity and should be an opportunity for all. But I also think something else is wrong with education. So I think education has worked in silos. And I think that the silos have been hugely detrimental. And the silos operate both horizontally and vertically. So within a given school, there's often not a lot of engagement across sectors. So the science teachers over here, and the math teachers over here, and the French teachers over here, and the English teachers over here. Things like co-teaching or looping of teachers, other things that allow for an interdisciplinary approach don't happen. And the further up the academic ladder you go, the less integrative the experience is. And by the time you get to higher education, the French department doesn't speak to the Spanish department, and the history department's over here, and the science department is over here. And since when, by the way, do problems in the real world fit within one single little category? They don't. And people like don't wear a tag saying, oh, this is a science problem, this is a math problem, this is an English problem. And so one of the things we need to do is silo bust. And we need to silo bust across and horizontally and vertically. So, for example, might it be a good idea to have more co-teaching? Might it be a good idea to have a problem that an institution thinks about from all perspectives, where we recognize that the disciplines cross and let teachers and professors and others work together? And let me add that perhaps the worst thing we do in education is we have really bad transitions. We can't transition kids into school, then we can't transition them from primary school to middle school, then we're really not so good at getting from middle school to high school, then we're equally not so good at getting from high school into college, and then once they get into college, we're not so good at getting them out into the workforce or into graduate school. And by the way, each of the schools thinks their job is done when they graduate and exit from them, instead of seeing an ongoing responsibility that they have for their students, not just from the moment they enter and graduate, but they have a responsibility for those students before, during, and after. So I think I would put a lot, I appreciate your observations on history, but I'd put a lot of blame on silos and the need to silo bust.
And I think you're 100% accurate on that. I mean, and I know that even this year, the district that I work in is now, we have to create transition plans for every child leaving elementary into middle. And we have to communicate these plans to middle school. And I understand the thinking, which is exactly what you said. We have to have some understanding that kids coming in and going out, we have to have transitions. But when you're talking silos, I 100% agree with that. That we have to get rid of this idea that I'm only this or I'm only that, or I can only do this or I can only do that. And I go back to even saying, when you were saying, the further you get up, the greater it becomes. And I remember being taught about cooperative learning through direct instruction when I was in school. And I found it the biggest irony. I'm like, you're talking about collaborative, cooperative learning processes, but you're not letting us actually do it. You're just telling us what it is. And I think a lot of times those pieces of application we're missing.
Think about this. College professors of math could learn a lot from how kids in elementary school are learning math. Actually, elementary math teachers could teach college professors a lot. Mm-hmm. Sadly, most college professors don't think they have a lot to learn from elementary educators who use manipulables and different kinds of online strategies. But you know something? They could enrich their collegiate teaching if they understood, okay, they got to ramp it up, but if they understood what some of these remarkable math teachers are doing at the elementary or primary school level. Mm-hmm. And yet our hierarchy is such that we think the further you go and the more content knowledge you have, the better you are as an educator. Not true.
True. I 100%. And I think even with that perspective is the same when we're talking about students' trauma and behavior and responses to trauma. The further you get up, the less I see empathetic processing, thinking, and support happening. It's why in a lot of schools, we have student resource officers in middle and high schools, because we see that as the bigger they get, the way we respond even changes. In elementary schools, a lot of elementary schools have SROs. We do not, but we do have a social worker, a school counselor, a mental health provider We have all of those pieces, but they don't have resources like that as you move up through the different tiers of school. And to me, it's like, it's not just academic, it's also in the social emotional health realm.
So I would say that instead of more policing, what we need is more crisis interveners. And some police may be able to do it, but people who are trained to deal with crises and helping kids re-regulate, helping kids work through conflict is way better than the fear of police and police thinking that discipline and separation and expulsion and punishment are the right strategies. So I'm not suggesting we don't have any good school policing. We have some, but we need fewer of them and more crisis interveners, at least right now, given the state of our world.
I couldn't agree with you more. I agree. And here's what I always find interesting, that, and I don't know who did this quote. I know it was it was in the early 90s and it was in a specific book, but it was, if we have students that come in that don't know how to do math, what do? We teach them math. We provide them interventions, right? We give them support. If a child doesn't know how to do and is not reading very well, we provide them interventions. We do the same. But when a child comes in and struggles with regulation, is what I call it, behavior is what a lot of other people call it, what do? Well, we punish, right? We've got to get out of this mindset that we're going to punish kids into building skill. It does not work. It's never worked. And I think what you just said fits right to that, right? This isn't about simply building compliant kids. It's about building kids' social and emotional, not learning, but health. And how we build that over time. Obviously, the earlier we can do an intervention and support for any family, including me as a father, the more support I can get as a new father or any father, the better that the outcomes will be for everyone. And so I think that we have to see this as a through line, even into higher ed, because we know what happens to a lot of kids when they get to be higher ed. I know what happened to me. And I was completely overwhelmed. It took me a long time to get out of college because, one, I didn't think I had the capacity. Two, I didn't think I had the ability. And three, I didn't know how to cope with it. And so I think that we've got to see this through line, just like we do and try to focus all on education, although it's all siloed, just as you said. We need to see this through line as looking at each other in a humanizing way and saying we have to build each other's capacity.
I have hope, though.
I do too. That we're having this conversation. That's hope in itself to me, honestly. And this is the 53rd conversation, which means there's 53 hours of conversations from people literally all over the world talking about this. And I think this is where it has to start. We have to have these conversations. And I know what you said, it's not the norm, Karen. I know what we're trying to attempt at my school is not the norm. But the reason we started is because we had to. We had to start the journey. What I found out and learned about neuroscience and the physiological and neurological and psychological responses to stress and trauma, if I didn't try to do something different, I was going to be committing malpractice. And so I think that as educators, we have to start continuing to have these conversations, continuing to put this information into the hands of our leaders, school leaders, grade level teams, principals, districts, because it's how we have to shift the paradigm.
So here's the interesting thing. There are lots of things for which we don't know the answers. There are lots of unknowns, but we really do know a fair amount about trauma and trauma responsive pedagogy and trauma responsive language. And we have remarkable new developments in that area. It's not an absence of knowledge. It's an absence of the sharing of that knowledge. There's information asymmetry. And so for me, the part that gives me hope is that we actually do know what to do. Not in every situation, and the research is ongoing, but there's a very robust body of research on trauma responsiveness and trauma pedagogy and how to help traumatized kids. we need to use it. We need to give it to people. We need to make our educators more aware.
And I think we have to be honest and say it's really hard work, because
Yes.
it is very challenging work. It
Yes,
actually,
but its absence is hard and
that's
has
exactly right.
way more
Fact.
serious long-term consequences.
Fact. And I will tell people, me sending a child home is easier on me as a principal. That would be easier on me. That's an easier fix for me, but I don't do my job for me. My work is not about me. And that personal responsibility that I take as a trauma-informed principal, that puts more responsibility on me than if I just sent a child home, because that's not focusing on what the child needs. It's what I or the teacher or the school feels they need. And I think that it is a bit of a heavier weight, but the outcomes we know is the greater the impact, because I think people are afraid to do it differently, that they might be doing it incorrectly. And there is no playbook that's perfect. That I think we're all on this paradigm shift journey together of navigating it in ways that are beneficial for the kids and the adults in the building. And so I think it's important, because when we speak about trauma informed, it's easy to talk about it in a scientific, neurological, academic way, but the practicality of it, having been doing this work for many years, we have to validate the challenges of it, because it is challenging.
Okay, so I know we're coming close to time here, but I wouldn't want to leave without talking about the segue from what you're saying. It is hard. It's very hard for educators. Look, change is hard, and not even change of this magnitude is hard. And we're living in a world that's also filled with difficulty and tension and anxiety that educators themselves are experiencing. So I want to say two things. I think schools that have care rooms for their educators are doing a really good thing. If you can have a care room for both students and educators, not the same room, a different room, all the better. Because I think people need a place to process what's going on. And the second thing I would say, in addition to care rooms, is I think we have to recognize that trauma can be transmitted. It can go from student to teacher. It can go the other way too. But teachers can experience trauma, secondary trauma, from their students. And so for me, one of the most important things to recognize is that you can't pour from an empty cup, or you can't pour from a cup with holes in it. So we've got to help our educators if we want to help our students. And it's really easy to put more and more and more on the teachers at whatever level, without recognizing the difficulties that they themselves are experiencing, both initially in terms of their own trauma, but also the trauma of the students, the backflow from their student trauma. So teachers are tired, they're exhausted, they're dealing with really hard issues. And so they've got to exercise self-care. And self-care is not selfish. And sadly, the people in the caring professions are generally the ones least able to self-care, because they want to give and give and give. And yet, it's really hard for us who are caregivers to step back enough to take care of ourselves.
And I think too, Karen, I don't know if you're familiar with a strategy that my school uses that is called tap in and tap out. And I think this is something that any school can implement literally tomorrow, where we use an app called, it's GroupMe. It's a messaging app where teachers can actually message the social and emotional health team of my school and say, I need a tap out. And that means I'm dysregulated for whatever reason. As a child dysregulated me, I'm dealing with something at home. We give them the opportunity to literally step away we actually have 2 adults respond. One adult will step in and say, do you want me to go with you? Do you need somebody to be with you? Co-regulation or not? And they can say, no, I just need a minute. That allows the teacher, not just on a long term, but in those moments, because I can tell you that in those heated moments, it's really hard. And so I think when we do these little pieces of just saying, we see you, this job is hard, you're dealing with things outside. I can't even go into the mass amount of life experiences that just this year, teachers in my school, and even myself, I lost my mom in last April. These experiences, we are human beings. And I think these little pieces of just saying, hey, we see you, let us know when you're in that space. We are going to give you that moment. You can go to, we have something called Be Well in Schools, where we teach mindful breathing and movement to kids as a proactive approach for teaching regulation skills. Adults can go to that space and go through the same processes.
So your kids and your educators are very fortunate to have you.
But everybody needs to have fortunate teachers and kids in their schools. And that's why we do this. And that's why I do this, because this is the work we have to do. So Karen, what is the last thing you want to tell all the educators out there? I know we went a few minutes over, but I always end with this. What do you want educators to know right now?
I want educators to know that we can believe in the power of the possible. And we also can believe that education happens in many places and spaces, of which the classroom is but one. And I think those are ideas worth keeping in mind, because I think if you believe in the power of the possible, it's what enables you to move forward. And I think if you recognize that education is not confined to a classroom, it takes place in the halls, it takes place in lunchrooms, it takes place on athletic fields, it takes place in many spaces and places. And I think if we recognize that and then use the architecture name, frame, and tame, or name, tame, and frame, we can find hope for more students succeeding. And I commend you both for the work you do in your own school, but also for these podcasts. They're hugely important. So,
and I really appreciate it. And thank you for taking almost an hour to sit down and have a conversation with me and share with the many listeners that we've had live, even here today, is from as far as New Zealand. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your experience, and the words that you shared. If people want to follow you on any social media, where can they find you?
So I'm pretty easy to find. I have a website, www.karen, Karen, Gross, Gross, education.com. That has a contact form. I also am on LinkedIn. I'm also on Twitter. I write on Medium. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Facebook. So your listeners can find me any number of ways. And I do write a fair amount. And I often engage with art in the work that I do. So for those who want to add a creative piece to it, that's something I do as well, and often use my own artwork with students and engage in installation art projects with students. So my website's the best place. So I look forward to hearing from you, and I would welcome your listeners reaching out.
Awesome. Thank you so very much. Andrea says from New Zealand, thank you for your insight and encouragement. And thank you for listening, Andrea. We really appreciate that. I know it is certainly not, it's either really late or very early. And I know the time difference is going to be massive because I'm coming to you in September in Australia and also New Zealand. If you want to follow me, my name or my Twitter and Instagram is Principalist. My Facebook is Matthew Portell or Paradigm Shift Ed, TIE Network or TIE Network Cast. And always use the hashtag Disruptors Unite. That's what this is about. It's about us coming together as a collective and disrupting what we know is not working. and starting to shift the paradigms for kids, educators, families, and communities across this globe. So thank you all very much. And as always, if you need to, please, please, please wear a mask and wash your hands.
And a thank you to you for having me and to the important work that you and your listeners are doing.
I greatly, really do appreciate it. We still have listeners on here. I just stopped the recording of the podcast. Karen, thank you so much. What an amazing dialogue and a lot to think about. And the work you have already done and the work you continue to do is doing nothing but shifting this paradigm that we all are so very passionate about. So thank you so very much. Listeners, we will be back next week on Thursday at 7 p.m. With another amazing guest. I will be producing the graphic for that this evening. And I cannot wait to see you all back here next week. So thank you. Karen, if you'll hold on just a second. Listeners, thank you very much. And we will see you next Thursday.